Hey everyone, did you know that over 90% of you watching right now haven't hit that subscribe button yet? If you're enjoying our stories about real-life gangsters, take just a second to subscribe. It's free, and it really helps us keep bringing you more true gangster tales every day. So sit back, relax, and let's dive into another story from the world of the mob. The night Joe Adonis stepped off the train into New York City, the air was thick with the scent of ambition, a mix of coal smoke, rain, and the perfume of opportunity. He was just a boy then, fresh from Montemarano, Italy, with his mother's rosary tucked in his coat and a look in his eyes that made older men uneasy. The city around him roared with noise and motion, but Joe didn't flinch. He wasn't overwhelmed. He was studying it, watching, learning, absorbing everything. They said America was the land of dreams, but Joe knew dreams meant nothing without control. And control was something he intended to have. He started small, sweeping barbershops, shining shoes, carrying groceries. But even at 15, Joe Adonis had something magnetic about him, a charm that wasn't just in his smile, but in his silence. He never spoke more than he needed to, but when he did, people listened. His dark, slicked hair, immaculate clothes, and calm, confident posture gave him the air of someone far above his station. In those early days, he crossed paths with other boys chasing the same illusions. Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, Bugsy Siegel, names that would one day echo through the streets of New York like legends. But back then, they were just hustlers with empty pockets and big ideas. Joe and Lucky hit it off immediately. Where Lucky had the brains and charisma to unite people, Joe had the composure and the polish to make their operation look legitimate. Together they worked the streets, bootlegging, gambling, protection rackets, each move careful, calculated, never reckless. But Joe was different from the others. While most men in the racket wore their toughness like armor, Joe wore elegance like a weapon. He was meticulous, his shoes always polished, his suits tailored, his words measured. People said he looked like a movie star. He liked that comparison. He cultivated an image, Joe Adonis, the Gentleman Gangster. He tipped generously, dressed better than most businessmen, and never raised his voice. But under that calm exterior, he was steel. When someone crossed him, he didn't rage or threaten. He simply looked at them, that same cool stare that seemed to drain the air from the room. They got the message. It wasn't long before the Prohibition era gave him the opportunity of a lifetime. Booze was illegal, but demand was endless. With Lucky, Lansky, and Siegel, Joe helped build a network that flooded the city with liquor. They operated like businessmen, organized, disciplined, untouchable. Joe handled the image. He made sure their enterprises looked legitimate: nightclubs, restaurants, import companies. Behind the glass doors and smiling doormen was a machinery of money and influence, greased by fear and loyalty. He was the one who smoothed things over when tensions flared, the one who turned chaos into order. Even law enforcement found him disarming. When they questioned him, he'd smile politely, shrug, and say, "Gentlemen, I sell perfume and fine clothes. What's criminal about that?" And for a while, it worked. The newspapers wrote about the mysterious, handsome man who seemed to know everyone in New York, from actors to politicians to bootleggers. The name Joe Adonis became both a whisper and a warning. But success comes with shadows. The more power they gained, the more dangerous their world became. Rival gangs wanted a piece of their empire, and blood spilled in alleys over territory and pride. Joe avoided direct confrontation whenever possible, not out of fear, but strategy. Violence drew attention. Attention brought police. And police meant risk. Still, there were nights when the city's tension seemed to hum through the air. Joe would stand on the balcony of his hotel suite, cigarette in hand, watching the neon lights flicker across Manhattan. Behind him, the muffled laughter of showgirls and gamblers filled the room. Lucky once joined him there, both men silent for a long while. Finally, Lucky said, "You ever think it ends, Joe? This life?" Joe took a slow drag, exhaled into the night. "Everything ends, Charlie. But if we play it right, We'll end it on our terms. That became Joe's philosophy. Always be in control, even when the world burns around you. By the early 1930s, that control was being tested. The old gangs were falling, new alliances were forming, and the underworld was transforming from brute force to organization. The Castellammarese War had erupted, a bloody conflict between old-school bosses and young modernizers like Lucky. Joe wasn't a man who enjoyed chaos, but he understood it. War was opportunity, a chance to reshape the underworld into something smarter, leaner, untouchable. He became the diplomat, the man behind the curtains making deals, smoothing betrayals, and orchestrating peace talks that would define the next generation of organized crime. While others fought and died in the streets, Joe remained poised, unshaken, untouched. His loyalty to Lucky was absolute. He didn't crave the spotlight or titles. What he wanted was influence, quiet, lasting influence. When the dust finally settled and Luciano's commission was formed, a governing body to control the underworld like a corporate board, Joe was there, calm and collected, as one of its quiet architects. In the years that followed, his power was no longer measured by violence or territory, but by access. Joe could walk into a politician's office, a film studio, or a five-star restaurant, and doors opened. People saw him not as a criminal, but as a man of class. A gentleman whose handshake carried more weight than most men's fortunes. And yet behind the elegance there was always a shadow. The knowledge that his empire stood on secrets and silence. He often thought of that first night in New York, the smell of rain and ambition thick in the air. He had arrived with nothing but a name he'd made up and a dream that had turned into an empire. Now, as he looked out over a city that bent to his will, Joe Adonis couldn't help but wonder, was it worth it? He smiled faintly, adjusted his cufflinks, and whispered to no one, maybe. Because in Joe's world, uncertainty was never weakness. It was just another part of the game, and the game for him was only just beginning. The night Joe Adonis realized charm could be more powerful than a gun was the night everything began to change. It was 1922, and the city was a jungle where every man thought he was king. Joe had already carved out a corner for himself in Brooklyn. Not the biggest, not the richest, but one that ran smooth. No fights, no heat, no unnecessary attention. That was his way. While others shouted, Joe listened. While others rushed, Joe planned. He sat most nights in a back booth at a small Italian cafe near the docks. The place smelled of espresso and cigar smoke, and its walls whispered with gossip. Politicians, dock workers, and low-level gangsters all passed through there, and Joe listened to every word. He didn't drink much, just sipped a glass of wine and watched the city unfold around him. One night, Lucky Luciano slid into his booth without asking. His suit was wrinkled, his tie loosened, and there was a faint bruise on his cheek. "You hear about what's happening downtown?" he asked, lowering his voice. Joe leaned back, expression calm. "Depends which fire you mean. There's always something burning in this city." Lucky grinned, lighting a cigarette. "Masseria and Maranzano, the old bosses. They're gearing up for war, and every crew in between's about to get pulled into it." Joe swirled his wine, thinking. "Then it's time to choose sides wisely." Lucky nodded. "That's why I came. You've got something they don't. You don't make enemies. You make people want to work with you." It was true. Joe didn't threaten people. He made them believe they'd be better off on his side. And so, when the streets of New York began to run with paranoia and betrayal, Joe's corner of world stayed strangely peaceful. He dealt in calm, not chaos. The war raged on. The old guard clung to their traditions, loyalty through fear, power through blood. But the younger men, Lucky, Lansky, Costello, Siegel, and Joe, had a different vision. They wanted to run crime like business. No random violence, no unnecessary deaths. Money over madness. When the war finally reached its breaking point, Joe played his part quietly, but effectively. He wasn't the one pulling triggers, but he was the one arranging meetings, passing messages, calming tempers before they exploded. And when it was over, when the dust settled and Lucky Luciano emerged as the architect of a new order, Joe Adonis was one of the few who didn't have blood on his hands, yet had power as if he did. They met one night in a dim apartment in Manhattan, the city lights flickering through the blinds. Luciano, Lansky, Costello, Siegel, Genovese, and Adonis, the new architects of organized crime. They sat around a simple wooden table, no gold, no glamour, just men who had rewritten the rules. Lucky looked around the room, his eyes landing on Joe. From now on, we do this different. No more boss of bosses. We form a commission, we share power, we keep peace, and we make money, real money. Joe nodded, the corner of his mouth curving into a faint smile. And we keep our names clean. That was Joe's philosophy. Legitimacy was the best camouflage. While others chased titles, he chased appearances. He invested in nightclubs, restaurants, even legitimate businesses. His hands, at least on paper, were clean. Soon, Joe's reputation stretched far beyond Brooklyn. Celebrities greeted him by name, politicians shook his hand, and reporters wrote about his impeccable taste. He was photographed at boxing matches, at charity dinners, even sitting front row at Broadway shows. He looked like the kind of man who'd never seen a crime in his life. But beneath that tailored exterior, he was still the same calculating boy who stepped off the train years ago, watching, learning, moving pieces in silence. It wasn't luck that made him successful, it was timing. He knew when to step forward and when to fade into the background. He never needed to be the loudest voice in the room because everyone already listened when he spoke. One afternoon, he met with a young senator at a midtown restaurant, the kind of place with white tablecloths and waiters who spoke in whispers. The senator leaned in, nervous. "Mr. Adonis," he said, "they say you know people, the kind of people who can make things happen." Joe smiled politely. "I know people who like helping friends." "You a friend, Senator?" The man swallowed. "I'd like to be." Joe raised his glass. "Then let's drink to that." Deals like that built empires, not the kind you could see, but the kind that controlled what you did see. Joe knew influence was worth more than fear. Fear fades. Influence lasts. Still, no empire lasts forever. The end of Prohibition meant the rivers of easy money began to dry up, and Joe, like all of them, had to adapt. The liquor was gone, but gambling, racketeering, and unions, those were the future. Joe had investments in all three. He also started getting attention from men in suits who didn't drink or gamble, federal agents. They had files, questions, photographs. But Joe was always 3 steps ahead. His charm disarmed them. His clean records baffled them. He was polite, almost too polite, and never lost his temper. One agent later said, "Talking to Joe Adonis was like interviewing a ghost wearing a tuxedo. He smiled, answered every question, and told you absolutely nothing." But beneath that charm, there was an unease starting to grow. Joe could sense the shift. America was changing. The old days of handshake deals and quiet envelopes were giving way to investigations, hearings, and reporters digging too deep. He stood one evening at the edge of the Hudson River, coat collar turned up against the wind, watching the lights of Manhattan shimmer across the dark water. Lucky had already been arrested. Siegel was in trouble out west. The commission was under pressure. The golden age they'd built was cracking at the edges. Joe sighed softly, lighting a cigarette. The smoke curled into the cold air, vanishing almost instantly. "Everything ends," he whispered again. But not yet. Not while he still had cards left to play. Joe Adonis had always believed that silence was the most powerful weapon a man could wield. Not the kind born of fear, but of calculation. He used it to read people, to make them talk, to make them underestimate him. By the mid-1930s, that quiet control had made him one of the most respected and least understood figures in New York's underworld. But the higher a man climbed, the more people tried to pull him down. Joe's life was now split between two worlds. By day, he was the polished businessman, well-dressed, soft-spoken, the kind of man who could make deals over cappuccino and a smile. By night, he was the unseen force behind gambling rings, labor rackets, and nightclubs that hummed with jazz and whispers. He wasn't the type to get his hands dirty. He didn't have to. His reach extended through loyal men who owed him everything, from bouncers to bookmakers, from politicians to police captains. And yet, for all his success, there were moments when he felt the faint pull of something darker. He'd watch the city glitter under moonlight and think of the boy who stepped off the train years ago with nothing but ambition. Somewhere along the way, the dream of survival had become an empire, and the empire had become a trap. One night, while he was walking through a crowded nightclub he partly owned, Joe spotted Lucky Luciano seated at a corner table, surrounded by his usual mix of businessmen and gangsters. Luciano waved him over. "Joey," he said with that smooth grin, "you're the only guy I know who can make money without saying a word." Joe smiled faintly. "Words are overrated." Lucky leaned in. "We're making progress, you know. The commission, and it's working. No more bloody power struggles. No more chaos. The cops can't figure out who runs what anymore. That's the beauty." Joe sipped his drink. "And when they do?" Lucky laughed. "Then we'll already be somewhere else." It was a good plan. For a while, it worked. The organization ran like a corporation, profits soaring, tensions low. But history has a way of catching up with even the smartest men. Federal investigators began prying deeper into the fabric of organized crime, and suddenly, the same men who had once been invisible were appearing in headlines. Luciano was arrested in 1936 on charges that shocked the city. Joe watched the trial unfold from a distance. The man who'd helped build the foundation of their empire was being torn apart by the system they had outsmarted for so long. When Lucky was finally sent away, Joe kept his face expressionless. But that night, sitting alone in his apartment, he poured himself a drink and whispered, "It's not over, Charlie." Because Joe understood something most didn't. Power wasn't about who sat in the chair. It was about who still held the connections, the influence, the loyalty of men who mattered. So while Luciano's empire was being dissected by prosecutors, Joe made sure its pieces didn't fall into enemy hands. He smoothed over conflicts, kept business running, and quietly made himself indispensable. Without ever declaring himself a leader, he became one. It wasn't without danger. Vito Genovese, hungry, ruthless, and far less patient, began to challenge the balance. Joe met him once at a quiet bar in Brooklyn, the kind of place where men talked in riddles. Genovese leaned across the table. "Luciano's gone. Things are changing. You can't sit on the fence forever, Adonis." Joe's eyes stayed calm. "I'm not on any fence. I'm just making sure the house doesn't burn down while everyone fights over who owns it." Genovese smirked. "That kind of talk can make people nervous." Joe smiled politely. "Then maybe they should calm down." That was the thing about Joe. He never raised his voice, never showed fear, and never gave anyone a reason to think he was weak. But even he knew the world was shifting. The old alliances were fragile, the government was getting bolder, and the media was feeding the public stories of crime and corruption like bedtime tales. Still, Joe's life went on in luxury. He owned a sprawling house in Fort Lee, New Jersey, overlooking the Hudson, where he hosted quiet gatherings. Politicians came disguised as friends. Actors came hoping for favors. Joe treated them all the same, polite, generous, detached. He loved good suits, expensive cologne, and a perfectly folded pocket square. To him, appearance wasn't vanity. It was armor. But for all the fine living, he was careful. He never trusted phones, never signed anything that could be traced, and never told a man something he didn't need to know. He carried himself like a gentleman because that's what made people forget he was anything else. Then came the war. World War II changed everything, not just for nations, but for men like Joe. Suddenly, the government needed help from people who knew the docks, the ships, the unions. They wanted security, information, influence. And the men who ran the streets of New York knew those better than anyone. Joe didn't need to get involved directly, but when Luciano, still behind bars, made his arrangement with the Navy, using his influence to secure the docks, Joe was quietly part of the machinery that made it possible. It was one of those strange moments in history where crime and patriotism blurred. After the war, Joe saw the writing on the wall. The world was growing smaller, more watchful. The FBI had new tools, new laws, new determination. The kind of men who used to operate in shadows were now being dragged into the light. He sat with Meyer Lansky one evening at a quiet club in Florida. The two men spoke softly, surrounded by the hum of jazz. "It's not like the old days," Lansky said. "Everyone's getting too loud, too flashy. These kids, they don't understand subtlety." Joe nodded slowly. "You know what happens when people get comfortable? They start believing they're untouchable." Lansky smiled thinly. "And you still don't believe that, do you, Joe?" Joe shook his head. "No one's untouchable, Meyer. Not me. Not you. Not anybody." It was that awareness, that quiet humility beneath all his confidence, that had kept Joe alive this long. But he could feel something approaching, a slow tightening of the walls around him. For all his charm, for all his caution, he knew the world he'd built was starting to crumble, not because of betrayal, but because of time. And time, as Joe Adonis was about to learn, was the one thing no man could charm. By the early 1940s, Joe Adonis had mastered the art of survival. He wasn't a man who bragged about his power because the truly powerful never needed to. While the world shifted around him, with wars, trials, and changing tides, Joe adapted like water, flowing around obstacles rather than fighting them head-on. That's what kept him alive in a business that buried men younger and bolder than him. But even water wears down stone eventually, and cracks were beginning to show. Joe's circle was shrinking. The old friends who had built the empire beside him were either gone, locked up, or lying low. Lucky Luciano was exiled to Italy, still respected, but far away. Meyer Lansky was moving money through casinos in Havana and the Caribbean. Costello was playing politics from behind velvet curtains. And Joe? He was still in New York, steady, visible, and very much on the radar. One cool evening, Joe sat at his usual spot in a Manhattan club, a cigarette burning slow between his fingers. The music was soft, the laughter polite, but beneath the glamour he could feel something off, the hum of suspicion. Across the room, a man he didn't recognize was pretending to read a newspaper. The way his eyes flicked up every few seconds gave him away. Joe leaned back, smiling faintly. "Feds," he muttered under his breath. He had grown used to them. They followed him everywhere, snapping photographs, watching his meetings, writing down license plates. It was no longer about what he was doing. It was about who he was. The name, Adonis itself, had become a symbol of the old world the government wanted to tear down. He'd go home at night to his wife and children, play the role of the quiet family man. His house in Fort Lee was elegant, filled with light and laughter. To neighbors, he was just Mr. Adonis, charming, polite, generous. The kind of man who sent wine at dinner parties and remembered everyone's birthday. But when the lights went out and the city grew silent, Joe would sit by the window, smoke curling in the dark, and think of how fragile it all was. He knew too much, had seen too much. Every man he'd ever trusted had secrets, and every secret could one day be sold. The new generation of mobsters, brash, impulsive, greedy, didn't understand the code. They flaunted their wealth, courted attention, and underestimated how much the government had learned since the Prohibition days. Joe's strength had always been his restraint. He didn't fight wars he couldn't win. So when the heat grew unbearable, he did what no one expected. He stepped back. In the late 1940s, he quietly started shifting his interests out of New York. He invested in businesses out west, helped Lansky with ventures in Cuba, and made sure his money could move faster than any subpoena. He still visited the old neighborhood sometimes, but he knew he was watching a fading photograph. One of those visits brought him face to face with Frank Costello, who was still holding court in his luxurious suite at the Waldorf. Costello poured him a drink and said, "You know, Joey, we built something that can't last. The world's too loud now, everyone's trying to be famous." Joe smirked. "Fame's a disease, Frank. We were lucky to grow up before people caught it." Costello nodded. "And now it's killing the next generation." They talked deep into the night, two old architects of an empire they both knew was dying. They weren't sentimental. Men like them didn't mourn eras. They adapted to the next one. But as the years passed, Joe noticed the whispers getting louder. The press painted him as a shadowy puppet master. The FBI called him one of the most influential underworld figures in America. Even when he was doing nothing wrong, his name was enough to draw attention. Then came 1950, the year the spotlight turned blinding. The Senate's Kefauver Committee started televised hearings into organized crime, and America was suddenly fascinated with the mob. Millions tuned in to see men like Frank Costello testify under oath, their voices trembling under the weight of the truth. Joe Adonis refused to appear. When reporters hounded him, he just smiled, shrugged, and said, "Gentlemen, I'm a businessman. I don't know anything about that other world you're talking about." But privately, he knew it was over. The walls were closing in, not with gunfire or betrayal this time, but with cameras, subpoenas, and microphones. The government wanted a symbol, someone who represented the sophisticated, untouchable mobster. Joe fit that image perfectly. And so, even without solid evidence, they began to build a case. Charges of tax evasion, illegal gambling, conspiracy, it was a familiar pattern. The same strategy they'd used against Capone. Joe had avoided it for decades through sheer discipline and discretion. But now, every move he made was being watched. Still, he never panicked. When an associate once asked him if he was worried, Joe smiled and said, "Worry's a waste of time. If you can fix it, fix it. If you can't, have a drink and wait." But as the heat grew, Joe realized there was only one way to fix this. He began to consider leaving the country. At first it was just an idea. Italy, maybe. A place where the air was slow, the food good, and no one cared about Senate hearings. But as the government's grip tightened, that idea began to sound less like an escape and more like a necessity. He didn't tell many people, not even Costello at first. But one night, as they walked along the Hudson under the orange glow of the streetlights, Joe finally said, "I'm thinking about going back to where it all started." Costello stopped. "Italy?" Joe nodded. "I've had my run here. Maybe it's time to let the city breathe again." Costello looked at him for a long moment, then said quietly, "You always knew when to walk away, Joey. That's what kept you alive." Joe smiled faintly. "And what'll keep me free?" He wasn't running. Not really. He was retreating with dignity, the same way he'd lived, quietly, elegantly, and on his own terms. Soon, word spread through the underworld that Joe Adonis was preparing to leave the United States for good. Some thought it was a bluff. Others said it was genius. But Joe didn't care what anyone thought anymore. He had outlasted wars, rivals, betrayals, and investigations. He had built an empire from nothing and walked through fire without ever losing his composure. Now, as the lights of Manhattan shimmered across the river one last time, Joe Adonis smiled to himself and whispered, "I came here with nothing, and I'm leaving with everything that mattered." By 1951, Joe Adonis's decision to leave the United States was no longer a secret. The newspapers were buzzing, the FBI was circling, and everyone in the underworld was whispering the same question. Was Joe really walking away? He had been summoned before federal authorities multiple times, each session more tense than the last. They wanted answers, they wanted names, but Joe, as always, gave them nothing. He was polite, charming, even funny at times, but he never slipped. It infuriated them. Every question met with a smile. every accusation deflected with calm dignity. When one official asked him if he was a member of a criminal syndicate, Joe leaned forward and said softly, "Sir, I don't even play cards. My only crime is being too good-looking." The room had erupted in nervous laughter, but behind those smirks was frustration. They couldn't touch him. Not the way they wanted. Still, the law had found a loophole. Joe had never become an American citizen. He'd lived in the country for decades, built businesses, raised a family, even served his community quietly. But technically, he was still an Italian national. That technicality would become the weapon they used to remove him. The government declared him an undesirable alien and ordered his deportation. It was their way of saying, "We can't convict you, but we can exile you." When the order came, Joe didn't rage or argue. He just nodded. "So that's how it's gonna be," he said softly. "Fine." His wife wept when he told her. His children were confused. How could a man who had lived in America nearly all his life suddenly be forced to leave? Joe tried to comfort them. "It's not forever," he said, though deep down he knew it might be. "You'll visit. We'll make it work." In those final weeks, he tied up every loose end. Businesses were transferred, debts settled, money secured in places no one could reach. Friends came to visit him in Fort Lee, some out of loyalty, others out of guilt. Frank Costello came by one night with a bottle of scotch and 2 glasses. They sat on the porch watching the skyline across the river. "So this is it, Joey," Costello said quietly. Joe smiled faintly. "Looks that way. You could fight it, you know. You got people who'd back you." Joe shook his head. "Fight what, Frank? They've already decided sometimes walking away is winning." Costello studied him for a long time, then raised his glass. "To staying free." Joe clinked his glass gently. "To staying smart." A week later, he was gone. The ship left from New York Harbor under a pale morning sky. A few close friends stood at the dock, their hats low, their faces solemn. Joe stood at the rail, the cold wind whipping his coat. He didn't look back, not once. The skyline, the city that had made him and tried to destroy him, disappeared into the mist. When he arrived in Naples, Italy, he was greeted not as a fugitive, but as a legend. Locals knew his name, Giuseppe Doto, the quiet man from America who had built an empire across the ocean. They treated him like visiting royalty, but Joe had no interest in being a king. He bought a villa outside Naples, a quiet, sun-drenched place surrounded by olive trees and sea air. There, for the first time in decades, he lived simply. No meetings, no phone calls at midnight, no eyes watching from unmarked cars. The mornings were peaceful, the kind of peace he hadn't known since his youth in Montemerano. He'd rise early, drink espresso by the balcony, and watch the sea stretch endlessly before him. He wrote letters to his family, sent gifts, and read newspapers from New York to keep up with the world he'd left behind. But even in peace, ghosts have a way of following. The American papers still used his name whenever crime made headlines. Joe Adonis, associate linked to illegal gambling, they'd write, even when he hadn't spoken to that man in 20 years. To the press, he was still the face of the old Mafia, sharp suits, slick hair, the symbol of a vanished era. Sometimes that made him smile. Sometimes it made him tired. He'd meet with old friends who passed through Italy, exiles, businessmen, wanderers like himself. They'd talk about the old days, the clubs, the rackets, the hustle. But Joe rarely spoke of his own deeds. "That was another life," he'd say, sipping wine. "I'm just a ghost now." And yet, even in exile, his influence didn't fade. Messages still came from across the Atlantic. Quiet inquiries, offers, respectful gestures. Men in New York still mentioned his name carefully, like a blessing or a warning. One visitor, a younger associate from Brooklyn, once asked him, "Joe, do you ever miss it? The money, the power, the life?" Joe smiled, his eyes thoughtful. "You don't miss the noise once you've had silence," he said. The trick is leaving before the music stops. Years passed. His hair grayed, his pace slowed, but his sharpness never dulled. Even in old age, Joe Adonis carried himself with that same quiet confidence, the kind that made men straighten their posture when he entered a room. Every so often, he'd get a letter from his children. One of his sons visited and brought him photos of New York, the skyline, the streets, the restaurants he used to love. Joe would look at them for a long time, his expression unreadable. "Beautiful city," he'd murmur, "but it eats its own." In those last years, Joe seemed at peace. The empire was gone, the headlines forgotten, but the legend remained. He had lived his life on his own terms, never broken, never desperate, always one step ahead. And in the quiet hills of Italy, he found something he'd never had in all his years in America: rest. The villa in Naples had grown quieter with each passing year. The once frequent visits from friends and associates slowed to a trickle, replaced by long, contemplative days under the Italian sun. Joe Adonis, Giuseppe Doto, as his birth certificate read, was no longer the young man in sharp suits commanding respect on Brooklyn corners. He had become something else entirely, a man living among memories, surrounded by ghosts who only spoke when the wind brushed through the olive trees. Yet, even in solitude, Joe's mind was never idle. He kept a daily routine, disciplined and almost ritualistic. Every morning he read the Corriere della Sera, followed by the New York Times, sent by mail. He wanted to know what had become of the city that once moved to his rhythm. He followed every headline about organized crime, every courtroom battle involving men whose hands he'd once shaken. When he read about Frank Costello's retirement, he smiled faintly. "Smart man," he murmured. He knew when to bow out. When he saw news about Albert Anastasia's assassination, he stared at the page for a long time without speaking. Then he folded the paper neatly and set it aside. "He never saw it coming," Joe whispered. "Nobody ever does." Even from across the ocean, he could sense that the old world, the one he had helped build, was fading. The new generation of mobsters was different. Louder, greedier, reckless. They didn't understand the old rules of quiet power. To Joe, it felt like watching a grand house crumble, stone by stone. One afternoon, he received a letter from an old associate, one of the few who still remembered the way things used to be. It read simply, "They don't make men like you anymore, Joe. The game's changed. The code's gone." Joe folded the letter and tucked it into a drawer, where dozens of others rested. He didn't need to reply. He knew the truth in those words. The code, honor, silence, respect, had died long before most realized it. Sometimes he'd walk through the small town nearby, unnoticed by most locals. To them, he was just Signor Doto, the quiet gentleman who always tipped well and kept to himself. They didn't know that once, in another country, his name could make entire rooms fall silent. At night, he'd sit on his balcony overlooking the sea. The waves were his only audience, the moon his only companion. He'd pour himself a glass of wine and talk softly, as if to someone who wasn't there. "We did all right, huh?" he'd murmur. "Could have gone worse. Could have gone like Bugsy." Sometimes he'd dream of Brooklyn, the smell of rain on concrete, the hum of traffic, the laughter spilling from corner bars. He'd see the old faces, Luciano, Costello, Genovese, all sitting around a table thick with cigar smoke. They'd be arguing over something trivial like the old days, and Joe would just smile, listening, knowing how it would all end. And then he'd wake up, the Mediterranean light streaming through the shutters, the sounds of the village below breaking the spell. Years went by like that until the early 1970s, when age began to weigh heavily on him. His hands trembled slightly when he wrote, his steps slower, but his mind was as sharp as ever. A doctor from Naples visited him occasionally, offering polite concern that Joe brushed off with a smile. "Doc, if I've made it this far," he'd say, "it's not medicine keeping me alive, it's stubbornness." One morning, a young journalist from New York came knocking. He had tracked Joe down, chasing the rumor that the great Joe Adonis was still alive, still sharp, still in control. Joe received him kindly, poured him coffee, and let the young man talk. "You were one of the original power players," the journalist said eagerly. "You helped shape the American underworld. What was it really like back then?" Joe chuckled, his eyes glinting. "Kid, you can't understand the past with today's eyes. Back then, we didn't think we were villains. We thought we were building something. Structure and chaos. You want to call it crime? Maybe. But we had rules. We believed in loyalty. You can't say that about many men today." The journalist scribbled notes asking about Lucky Luciano, about the commission, about whether Joe regretted anything. "Regret?" Joe repeated softly, leaning back in his chair. "Sure, I've got regrets. Everyone does. But I learned early. If you spend your life looking backward, you miss the only thing you still have, the time left." Before leaving, the young man asked one final question. "Do you think there's still a place for men like you in today's world?" Joe smiled faintly. "No," he said, "and that's probably for the best." After the journalist left, Joe sat quietly, watching the horizon fade into dusk. He felt a strange calm, as if the last piece of his story had finally been told. Not long after, his health began to decline. Nothing dramatic, just the slow, inevitable fading of a man who had lived 1,000 lives. He stopped reading the papers as often. The world had moved on, and he no longer felt the need to keep up. One evening, his caretaker found him asleep on the balcony, his half-empty glass of wine beside him. The sea breeze rustled through the trees and the air was still. He looked peaceful, like a man who had finally found the silence he'd been chasing his entire life. In the end, Joe Adonis left the world the same way he lived in it, quietly with dignity on his own terms. No headlines, no sirens, no spectacle. Just a man, alone, under the Italian sky, fading into legend. And somewhere across the ocean, in the city that once whispered his name with awe and fear, his shadow lingered, unseen but never forgotten. The autumn winds swept through Naples with a kind of melancholy rhythm, carrying whispers of the past through the narrow streets. Joe Adonis, Giuseppe Doto, sat by his window, staring out at the horizon where the sea met the sky in a soft haze of gold. To most, he was a forgotten man, a relic of another age. But to those who truly knew history, his name still carried weight. A name spoken quietly, with respect, maybe even a touch of fear. Life in exile had become almost peaceful, but peace was a strange thing for a man who'd spent his youth in the constant hum of danger. Every so often, Joe would catch himself listening for sounds that no longer came. The shuffle of feet outside his door, the ring of a phone that brought either opportunity or trouble. It had been decades since Brooklyn, but the rhythm of those streets was still buried deep in his blood. He often thought about how strange it was that a life like his could end in silence. "Ain't it funny," he said one night to himself, pouring a glass of red wine, "how we spent our whole lives making noise just to disappear quietly." The truth was, Joe had always believed he would die young. Most men in his line of work did. But somehow, he'd slipped through every trap, every knife, every bullet, every betrayal. Maybe it was luck. Maybe it was instinct. Or maybe, just maybe, it was because he'd always known when to walk away. Still, there were nights when sleep didn't come easy. He would lie awake, watching the ceiling as the clock ticked softly in the background, his mind drifting back to New York. The flashing lights, the smell of hot asphalt, the laughter echoing down Mulberry Street. He remembered the men who'd walked beside him, some now ghosts, others long forgotten. Lucky Luciano, his closest friend and sometimes rival, had always said, "We were soldiers of order in a world of chaos." Joe smiled when he thought of that line. It sounded noble, poetic even. But deep down, he knew the truth. They weren't soldiers of order. They were businessmen who thrived in chaos, and for a time, they ruled it completely. He recalled the days of the commission, that great experiment of balance and power. It was supposed to prevent bloodshed to bring structure to an unstructured world. And for a while, it worked. But time had a way of changing everything. The new generation had no patience, no discipline. They wanted fast money, flashy suits, headlines. They wanted to be stars in a business that once prided itself on the shadows. Joe could never understand that. To him, respect came from silence. Strength came from restraint. The minute a man wanted fame, he was already finished. It was that quiet wisdom that had kept him alive long after others had fallen. Anastasia, Costello, Genovese, Gambino, each had risen and fallen in his lifetime, each leaving behind legacies written in both loyalty and blood. Joe outlived them all, not because he was tougher, but because he understood something they didn't. That power wasn't about who shouted the loudest, it was about who could keep his mouth shut the longest. As the years rolled on, small traces of the old life found their way to his doorstep. A letter from an old associate in New Jersey. A postcard from someone claiming to be the son of a man Joe once knew. And once a visit from a former soldier of the Luciano family, an older man now, gray and cautious, but still with that glint of respect in his eyes. He brought news, stories of the old neighborhood, of how things had changed. "The kids don't even know your name anymore," he said softly, almost apologetic. Joe smiled faintly. "Good," he replied. "That means I did it right." He didn't want his name on anyone's lips, not anymore. He wanted to vanish completely, leaving behind only a whisper, a mystery. For a man who'd built his reputation on being untouchable, disappearing was the final victory. One day he received a package with no return address. Inside was an old photograph. Him, Lucky Luciano, and Frank Costello, standing together in front of a restaurant in Manhattan, smiling like ordinary businessmen. On the back, written in fading ink, were 3 words. Those were days. Joe traced the photo with a trembling hand, a rare tear gathering at the corner of his eye. "Yeah," he murmured, "they sure were." It was moments like these that reminded him how fast time could turn legends into memories. The streets of New York had forgotten him, but that didn't matter. He remembered them, every block, every face, every handshake. They were his, forever. As the sun dipped below the sea, he leaned back in his chair, feeling the warmth of the last light on his face. "We all get what's coming," he whispered. "Some of us just get more time to think about it." He didn't know it yet, but these quiet reflections were his final act, the calm before the curtain closed. Joe Adonis, once the most polished figure in the underworld, was now simply an old man surrounded by fading light, but there was a strange peace in that. He had done what few men of his kind ever managed to do. He had lived long enough to see the end of his own legend, and as the evening breeze carried the scent of salt and roses into the room, Joe smiled softly to himself, whispering words only he could hear. "Brooklyn, old friend," he said, eyes glistening. "You'll always be home." Then, in that fading Italian twilight, he closed his eyes, not in regret, but in gratitude for a life that had burned bright, played hard, and, against all odds, ended in peace. The next morning in Naples began like most others for Joe Adonis, soft light spilling through half-open shutters, the sound of distant bells from the hillside church, and the faint aroma of espresso drifting through the old apartment. But this morning carried a strange weight, an unspoken stillness that seemed to linger in the corners of the room. He woke slowly, his joints aching more than usual, and sat for a long time at the edge of his bed, staring at the floor as if remembering how to begin the day. Age had become his most loyal companion, patient and relentless. It reminded him of things he'd rather forget, of friends buried, of streets gone silent, of promises made in the heat of ambition. Still, there was something defiant about him, even in his late years. The posture, the sharpness in his gaze, it all hinted at the man he used to be. A man who once stood beside the most powerful figures of the underworld and smiled as if nothing could touch him. He still kept one small wooden box hidden in a drawer. Inside were relics from a past that felt like another life. An old money clip engraved with the initials J.A., a faded photograph of him and Lucky standing outside the Waldorf Astoria, and a gold ring he'd stopped wearing decades ago. Every so often, he'd take the box out, place it on the table, and just look at the pieces, silent reminders that he had lived through something extraordinary. That morning, as he sipped his coffee, a young reporter from Rome arrived at his door. She had somehow tracked him down, claiming she wanted to write about the legends who built the American dream in their own way. Joe laughed softly at that. "You make it sound like we were architects," he said, motioning for her to sit. She was polite, eager, maybe even a little nervous. "You worked with Charles Luciano, didn't you?" she asked carefully, trying not to sound like she was prying. Joe smiled faintly. "Worked with him? No, I walked beside him. There's a difference." She tilted her head, intrigued. "What was he like?" He thought for a long moment before answering. "Smart. Too smart for his own good sometimes, but he had vision, the kind that changes everything."